Welcome to another special episode of the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine. Today we have a very special guest. If you ever played a computer strategy game on your home microcomputer in the 1980s or 1990s, if you spent countless hours moving your troops around the battlefields, be it of Antietam, Vietnam, World War I, World War II, or even the mythical land of Krynn, or even better, if you were playing any of those amazing gold box games back in the day, you have this man to thank. Joel Billings, welcome to the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine.
Thanks. Happy to
So,
be here.
oh, happy to have you. As always, we would like to go all the way to the origin. So, when did you get interested in strategy games, war games, that kind of thing?
Okay. I got playing war games when I was 7, when my uncle, who was a World War II veteran, gave a game to my father, one of the early Avalon Hill games, Tactics 2. I think it was 1965. And my father taught it to me when I was 7. And we used to play Tactics 2, then Gettysburg, I think was the next game we played. And over the next couple of years, I got more and more into it. And by the time I was about 11 or 12, I mean, that was my main hobby, and it played a lot more than my father. And, I did things like in 8th grade, I was in the chess club, but I really wasn't a big chess fan. And I ended up converting the chess club into a war game club. And we
Nice.
all played a lot more war games than chess at that point. And it just kind of grew from there. It just kept going and going. I was really into all kinds of military strategy games, and then eventually even miniatures, naval miniatures, Napoleonics, and so on.
Cool. And so by the time you have to make a decision about what you're going to do with your life when you're going to college and stuff, did that influence your decision making in any way?
It didn't. I think at the time when I was going to go off to college, and it had been suggested that I probably by my mother and my uncle that I probably like economics, and I thought, sure, that's fine, even though I'd never taken an economics class. I thought, yeah, okay, I'll go get a degree in economics. And I think at the time in high school, I was doing a little fiddling around with modifying existing games, and as you do, make your own rules and adjustments and so on. And I thought, well, it'd be neat to work on war games someday. But I didn't think I would be able to do that. I thought that would, all the wargaming production was in New York and Baltimore. Avalon Hill and SPI were the two big companies, and I was in California. And so, my dream one day was to go back and do one of their 48-hour game weekends or something in New York City. But I didn't see actually getting into that industry. I just thought I'd go off and do something else for a living and play games for fun.
And so, what did you have any specific focus when you were studying at the
It, it
university other than business?
Yeah, it was quantitative economics is basically what it was. I went in with the idea of being an econ major with a math minor because I was definitely into math. And basically, yeah, I hit my level in my sophomore year where math was clearly not where I was going to go, but I still love the quantitative economics. And I used to play Stratomatic baseball, football, and keep statistics. I love numbers. I love statistics. I thought being a sports statistician would be just a fantastic job. That was another one. And so the quantitative side of it was interesting. So as in my sophomore year, as I hit the math, into my math road of hard math, it became clear, economics with the math element. Now, I had an odd situation my sophomore year. I ended up not being able to take a statistics class at my college at Claremont, and I had to. So I ended up taking a probability class at the next door college, Pomona. as it turned out, I did horribly in that class. I was a good student, but in this class, I just wasn't getting it. And 6 weeks in, after trying everything I could, I was flailing. So I went to the math department chairman at Claremont and said, I'm just dying in this class. I got to get out of this class." And he said, "Oh, why don't you come into my basic computing class that I teach? You can catch up over the weekend and basically do 6 weeks, do the 6 weeks work and take this class. It'll be, you'll enjoy it." So I did that. So at that point, I had no exposure to computers really, and other than they had a computer lab with DEC 10 terminals, I think at that point, that maybe I used in a class here or there. And I in that class my sophomore year, and that would have been 1976,
Okay.
I basically started using computers and writing basic programs. And I actually wrote for my class project a very simple war game, very, very simple war game program in BASIC. So that was, and at that point, I started thinking, I sort of knew computers were coming, and I always thought, wow, it'd be fun to, mix computers. At that point, I'd only used computers to generate random number sheets that we use for calculating miniatures hits on in naval miniatures. So, but anyway, this gave me the exposure to that. So then I continued on though in computer and quantitative economics and econometrics, and basically was using computers and the IBM 360 punch cards and all of that to do my projects. And my senior thesis was projecting the supply and demand of mainframes and mini computers, and there weren't even PCs at that point. They were called mini computers,
Yeah.
and PCs were like a minor subset of mini computers, which were just starting, and this would have been in 1978, 79.
Okay.
So that gave me an indication of that there were, what the computer market was going. And I saw this mini computer curve just going up and up and up, obviously, as they were coming into play, and how many were being sold. And I ended up that in May, literally maybe 2 weeks before I graduated, a friend of mine said, "Oh, you should go into Radio Shack and check out this computer, the TRS-80." And so that was the first time I saw a personal computer, and it was 2 weeks before I graduated from college.
Oh, wow. So it literally was last minute. And so you're graduating, you've got this quantitative economics degree. Are you actually planning on using it at this point?
Yeah. At that point, my professor mentor had tracked me into the university of getting an MBA at the University of Chicago. So I was all set. I was supposed to go, and I graduated at the end of May. I was supposed to go in September to the University of Chicago and get an MBA, and it was going to be in quantitative emphasis MBA.
Wow.
And
And
that,
Chicago is not necessarily unknown for its economics department.
You're right. Well, and that's the funny thing was when I went into college, I came from a college professor father and ultimately a college professor mother as well. And so the assumption was, oh, you get a degree in economics, you're going to go get a PhD. And the teacher that had the most influence on me in college, who taught the econometrics class, he thought, no, you don't want to get a PhD, you want to get an MBA. And he happened to track some of his better students to University of Chicago because he had a good in there, and he thought that would be a great fit for me because it was a very quantitative oriented program. And basically, I agreed with him, and so that's where I was going to be headed, was to do a very quantitative oriented MBA, with the idea that I would probably do what I was doing in my senior year. First semester, I had an internship at Amdahl Corporation, which made mainframes. They were a
Okay.
competitor of IBM at that point. And I worked in manufacturing, but then in the summer, I got a summer job right after college, and in the same company, and it was working in their business planning department, because I met them while I was doing my thesis and got information from them, and basically they were doing what I did on my thesis. They were forecasting the demand for their mainframe computers, which were, $3-4 million computers. They needed to know how many they thought people were going to buy. So I thought that's what I would do with my life. I would become a forecaster, an economic forecaster of, whatever, using econometrics. So that's what I was doing this summer after I graduated, and it was supposed to be just a 3-month job.
And did you end up staying there, or was that just the jumping off point to designing your own games?
Well, that's where basically what happened was I was back up in the Bay Area. I'd gone to college in Los Angeles. My uncle lived in the Silicon Valley, and I was back staying with my uncle working at the summer job. And that's when I got the idea to, actually go ahead and try to make a computer game and make one for one of the personal computers that were just coming on the scene. And it was basically in that time frame. It was from about the end of June when I first talked to somebody. And the story there is I was actually with a father of my girlfriend at the time. We were in San Francisco going to jazz bars, and and he was an IBM programmer, and I mentioned to him that, I was thinking that, someday it would be really cool to make these computer war games, make war games on computers. And he said he knew somebody who was also an IBM programmer where he worked who thought the same thing, and you should talk to him. And that's where the whole thing came from. That's the spark for SSI.
Okay. And so did you actually get together with this guy? Who was it?
I did. And I can't remember his name now, because what happened was I met with him a couple of times, and basically what it came up was that he was sort of a gamer, but he wasn't a war gamer. And he was a programmer at IBM, had a great job at IBM, had a family, and there was no way he was going to leave, the IBM for wargaming, because he didn't even really understand war games that much. It was more he had an idea about doing games on computers. It was very sort of generic, and I was very specifically interested in war games on computers, because I knew early on that, I used to spend hours and hours and hours playing these games solitaire. So I knew that, people spend hours playing solitaire because they couldn't find people to play against. And the other thing is that with a war game, there are war games where fog of war is necessary, and it's really hard to bring fog of war into the game. The classic game Battleship, where you have the divider, between, and you're just calling out, A5, and whether you hit the other person. That's classic fog of war done in a board game level. Well, you can't really do it very well. And I knew that it was a huge element that was missing from war games, because I had played a double blind sniper game at college where we had 2 boards and we had judges, and you were actually, moving the pieces on one board, your pieces, and they were moving theirs over there. And then the judge would say when you could see each other. And I knew that was a lot of fun, and that would be an element that the computer would do. So it was clear to me that, computers were natural for war game. If all it did was added a fog of war element and gave you somebody to play against, that would be it. I mean, then the war gamers would be in heaven.
And it makes perfect sense. And just keeping track of all the stats that are in a war game.
Well, there's that too.
Load off too. I mean, come on.
yeah, exactly. So that's, So basically, when it became clear that person was dropping out, I'd already spent, a week or two sort of thinking about, well, what would I want to do? What should we do? I tried to find out a little bit about the computers, what was going on. And it was sort of the month of July was a sort of a research month of putting this information together. And remember, I'm set to go at the beginning of September and, leave town and go to school. So I didn't have a lot of time. But my uncle, who was he was a CEO of SIVA, which was a subsidiary of Syntex and Varian, and he was a businessman a businessman who had done very well, but had also always wanted to have his own thing. So when I had the idea for this. He thought, he just kept pushing me, do it, you know, you push your idea as far as you can see, you know, see where it goes. So I kept doing that, and basically after that person left, by the time that it became clear that he wasn't going to stick around to do it, I'd already thought what I should do is try to find out, one, are there any wargamers out there who have computers who would actually buy something? And two, are there any wargamers out there who are programmers who would actually be interested in doing these games? So I put questionnaires in the 2 local game stores. I happened to be in an area like in LA, there was no game store, you know, where I lived, and so it was bad. But in the Bay Area, there was one in Palo Alto, and there was one in about 20 miles away in Los Gatos. So Silicon Valley had at least 2 war game, you know, hobby stores. So I put questionnaires out, and it basically asked people to fill them out. And then at the end, it said, if you're a programmer and you're interested in making war games, you know, give me a call. And I got 2 phone calls, you know, from people, and they became the first 2 programmers.
Oh, okay. And so were you in charge of design at this point, and then working with the programmers to implement the
Yeah.
design?
Basically, the initial idea was, okay, we have to do something very, very simple. So what's the war game topic that is simple to do, both from as much from an AI point of view, is like, how much would you get the AI to do? Because we didn't know how to make artificial intelligence back then. So I came up with the idea of that the Bismarck, the Hunt for the Bismarck, which I'd played the Avalon Hill game, and I actually had played like 3 different board games on the subject of the Bismarck, the Hunt for the Bismarck. And I thought, okay, that's a natural, because Fog of War is huge, and in the board games, you always have this this Fog of War element that is sort of, as you do things, you're giving away your information, because if you start saying, well, are you here? Well, if you're able to say, are you here, then that's telling the other person that you must be there.
Yeah.
And so that it was only so good. So I thought, well, that's an easy situation. I mean, a good situation for Fog of War, and it's an easy situation because there's only 2 ships, actually a few more when you count the supply ships. But there's the Bismarck and the Prince Eugen, and that's basically all you have. And it would be easy to get the AI to move these ships around, and voila, that was the design, the topic. And then as far as the design, yeah, I basically did the initial design and passed it off to John, and John Lyon, the first programmer, and he basically he said, okay, I'm going to go off and I'm going to make a Fox and Hounds game. That was basically what he called it initially. I'm just going to see if I can program a grid where I've got the Fox and the Hounds, and they're moving around. And he did it, and then he did it on, not on an Apple or a TRS-80. He did it on a little mini computer that we got from the head of the home brew club of the Amdahl, at Amdahl, where I was still working. This home brew club, head of the group, he let John borrow his computer, or basically he let John come over to his house and program at his house.
Oh, nice.
And so that's how that work started. So yeah, so I was responsible for giving the design and the rules to John, and then he was responsible for converting it into the computer program. And then at the same time, I was responsible for checking out the business side and figuring out, well, what will we do with this thing once we finished it.
Now, just I'm curious about this design document that you wrote. Did you actually write it as if it could be implemented as a board game at this point?
I don't remember. I honestly don't remember, but I will admit to the fact that I basically had 3 different board games that on the subject and research materials, and I basically started going and copying and taking stuff from these elements and saying, okay, this is what I want to do. So I created a board, I created and I don't remember, and I know there's a lot of similarities with the Avalon Hill Bismarck game. I don't remember now how close the similarities are. Like if you went and compared the Avalon Hill board game with our map, is it the same map? I don't think it is exactly. As like I said, I was working from 3 different maps and other things, but but there are some similarities in the games, absolutely, and similarities obviously in the situation. I mean, actually the Avalon Hill game had a more detailed, advanced game with more stuff in it. We were basically doing the stripped down. We've just got these couple of German ships. That's it.
Gotcha. Now, your and Avalon Hill games. I mean, I've tried to tackle a couple of them over the years, and yeah, that was one mountain too far for me.
Mm-hmm.
But okay, so you're off and now having to do the business side of this while the program's being written. What did that entail at this point?
Well, the first part was my uncle knew Brooke Byers, who was a venture capitalist in Silicon Valley, and he's part of a big company that actually ultimately invested in EA, in Trip Hawkins in Electronic Arts. But that came a few years later. But there's a definite connection in all of this, which you'll see as we go through this. But basically, he introduced me to Brooke. I talked to Brooke. Brooke said, "Oh, how much money are you talking about, for this?" And I'd figured out that it really we weren't like looking to make this huge company right away. We were just a couple of guys making one game. So I figured out, what it would sort of take for that. And Brooke knew right away that, okay, this isn't something that he did, but that there are sort of angel investors or whatever they call them, the people who basically will invest $50,000, $100,000 into something at the seed money to
Yeah.
start. And he gave me the name of somebody. His name was Sam Holstetter, I think, in the Silicon Valley area. And he said you should go meet with him. So basically, right before that meeting, and this meeting, I think the first one probably happened in early August, I literally took a day and whipped up a business plan. And this is where my Claremont education and my work at Amdahl and what I knew how to do with econometrics really kicked in. So I was able to write basically the first 7-8 page business plan, which I still have. I think I sent it to the museum that has the records, and basically it listed out, okay, this is what we think we can do in 5 years. This is how many games, this is how big the war game market is, this is how big we think the computer war game market's going to be, and so on. And you're probably thinking, well, how can you figure this stuff out when there is no computer market at the time? But, I had it figured out in a way because I had some SPI information they published in Strategy and Tactics about the size of the war game market. So I knew how much the size, sort of an idea of what the size of the war game market was. I made some assumptions about how many war gamers would own computers, which I did. The questionnaire work I did with the game stores got me some information about how many people had computers. And a surprisingly large number of people had computers even that early because it was Silicon Valley. so
Exactly.
so I knew that it was a little, skewed, clearly skewed, but I could also see that, hey, the Radio Shack is becoming mass market now. And so anyway, I put together this business plan, and then I went off to meet Sam, and Sam Holstetter basically said, "Oh, you've got to meet this guy at Apple Computer who's a marketing director there, and I use him for all my information about the what's going on in the computer business and the upcoming PC business." And again, this is summer '79, and that person that he introduced me to was Trip Hawkins.
Oh, geez.
So basically, and now you can see why it's important to be in the right place at the right time.
Yeah,
so,
definitely.
so Trip came to the next meeting I had with Sam, and he brought along his Apple II, and he literally did a song and dance on why we should make games for the Apple II. And he was basically a product marketing manager at that point, and he was evangelizing the Apple computer to everybody he could find. And he convinced me at the time that, yeah, this would be much better than the TRS-80 because it's got color. It's a color graphic screen instead of black and white. And that's about all I knew at that point. And so anyway, I met Trip, and I have the information together, and this is how much we need. And I think we said we would need $100,000, but to get going. But then really my uncle said, well, how much do you really need, cash? And I think I said, well, if we can get by without paying salaries, or we pay stock in lieu of salaries for a certain amount of time, and I'll keep working full time at this Amdahl job, because they extended me, they were willing to extend me, and it came down to, we ended up, I think, raising $35,000 or $40,000. That's
Oh,
all we
wow.
needed. And he and my uncle basically said, okay, don't sell a piece, don't bring in the investors. We don't need the investors. Literally, my grandparents had had some money. One had just recently died 6 months before, my grandfather, and my grandmother was living with my uncle, and he basically said, look, we have 27,000 or something in this that we're willing to invest. So we'll invest the grandparents' money into the company, and you try to get whatever you can from employees or family of employees. So we raised something like $37,000 from employees and families of employees at that point, and that was what funded SSI.
Oh my goodness. And so at this point, when you're saying employees, it's basically you and the programmer, correct?
Yeah, I mean, at that point, by when I had the original business plan in early August, the 7-pager, that got them interested. So then it became clear, well, you need a better, more fleshed out business plan. So I had I was working in the business planning department of Amdahl, and there was a guy named Dave Bowen who worked there, and he said, hey, I'll work with you on a more fleshed out business plan, and you can pay me in stock. And so basically at that point we started putting together, what is this going to be? And so yes, there was the 2 programmers that I met, John Lyon, Ed Williger, myself. There was Dave Cook was the homebrew computer club guy at Amdahl, and he was going to be our tech guy, sort of. And so he was theoretically there, and I'm trying to think of who else. There wasn't much else. I mean, we basically had 4 or 5 people that we, were part of this first group, and yeah, that was it. And yeah, go ahead.
That's already a pretty, I mean, so there's a lot of stories about companies starting out very, very small with a couple of guys make some games, copy it onto cassettes and sell it in stores. You're taking this from a whole different approach, almost a Trip Hawkins-esque approach, which matches up with your background, your business background. But when you go into it, that more fleshed out business plan, is it already talking about release schedules and things like that?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I had already done that. I mean, you have to realize in the 7-page business plan, I just started guessing how many games we could make in a year, just based on, on 2 weeks of work, right? So, I'm making up stuff as I go. Well, a month later, we have a little bit more information, and we start making up more stuff. And the interesting thing, by the way, is that if you go out 5 years and you compare the business plan, the 7-page business plan model, and what our sales were for the first 5 years at SSI, it's within 10% of what they were.
Really?
So I'm very proud of that. Now, on the cost side, I was way low. Our costs were much higher than what I expected. So our profitability, although we did get profitable within the first year, it was not profitable as much as I thought, because I didn't have experience understanding what the costs were going to be. But the sales, I nailed it I'm very proud of that. Because just by looking at the shape of the war game industry over time, and the shape of the computer industry and what I expected it to be based on some simple projections, I could extrapolating what my percentage I thought would take out of the market. I came up with some numbers, and so it was a top down instead of a bottom up. At that point, it was not how many games are we going to make; it's how big is the market and what are we going to take of the market. And by doing it that way, I figured out what we'd have. Now, by a month later, when we put the more detailed plan together with Dave Bowen, we'd started thinking about, okay, how are we going to make these games? how many computer programmers do we need to make these games? How many can we make in a year? How many, and so on. So yes, by the time that plan was fleshed out, which might have been a month later, we had some expectations about what we were going to do. And I'll tell you, a lot of them were totally wrong. The biggest one that was wrong was we went into it thinking, okay, we're going to be like SPI. We're going to have all these in-house people working and creating these games. So we're going to have this big design staff and programming staff, and we're going to crank out games internally. And that's what SPI did, or at least that's my sense of what SPI did. They had a staff of people. Avalon Hill had a different model. They basically paid royalties to guys who did game designs. And they did the production end and the marketing end, but they didn't actually have the design staff. They had a few people who managed the development, but that was it. And that's where we ended up. Ultimately, we ended up with 80% of our games coming from, or more coming from outside designers.
Okay. And now, how long did it take you to realize that that was the way to go?
We didn't realize it. It happened. And what happened was that came later, because when Bismarck came out, about 2 months after Bismarck came out, we got our first game submission, which was Dan Button, who became Danny Button, and I don't know if you know the name, but
definitely. Seven Cities of Gold, Mule.
Right.
Yeah,
and Danny Button was the first person to submit, that I remember, the first person to submit a game to us, and it was probably 2 or 3 months after Bismarck came out, because at that point we were advertising, and there weren't that many people making games and putting them out. And we had, at that point, we'd come out with a high quality game and a high quality box, and instead of the shrink wrap bags that were out there. And Danny Button had done one game for I think a Canadian company, and it hadn't hardly sold at all, and it was a Ziploc bag kind of thing. And I guess he probably saw Computer Bismarck and thought, oh, well, here's somebody who's looks real. I'll submit his game. So he submitted a game which we ultimately published called Computer Quarterback. It's an American football game.
Yeah.
And that was a huge success for us. So we didn't plan on it. It just happened.
Amazing. And Dan Button, that's just like a huge. But going back 2 steps again. So
yeah.
You're going to produce this product, and like you said, there's not a lot of examples. I'm just researching our regular episodes. I just ran across what the first SSI ad I've noticed. It was, I believe, April 1980 issue of Creative Computing magazine.
Sure.
It's a one-page ad for the Trash 80 and the Apple II versions of Computer Bismarck.
Yeah.
And with nice picture of the packaging and everything on it. So obviously you're in a place that has software production going on because you're in Silicon Valley. Mm-hmm. What was it like? How did you just organize things like production of the packaging, the artist to make the sleeves, to design the logo, because you have the original SSI logo on this very first product that basically is the logo for the rest of the company. And how does distribution work at that point?
Right. Well, here again, it's a matter of luck and connections that basically, and it goes back to Andal again, because at the point at which now. So we basically, when I put off business school in September, we basically started racing towards getting Computer Bismarck done. We got our first Apple in October, and then we converted what John had done on the mini computer over to the Apple, and we moved towards getting it released in January of 1980. And around early December, I'd say, we started thinking, okay, we are going to get this game done. We're going to get it done here in a month or two. We need to package it. So I thought immediately, I want this to look just like an Avalon Hill game, because that's the high end. Strategy and Tactics, or SPI, they had these cheaper boxes and cheaper production values. Avalon Hill was the top of the line production value from a board game point of view. At least I thought at that time. So that's what I wanted. I wanted it to be, like that, and to go into stores. So luckily enough, my office mate at Amdahl was a young guy who had come out of Stanford a couple of years before, and he knew somebody who had also graduated from Stanford a year or two before, and who did graphic design, graphic art, and he suggested that I meet him and talk to him about getting working on the box, and also at that point the advertisement and so on. And that person was Louis Seikow,
Okay.
and Louis Seikow ended up becoming our artist and did 90% of the SSI boxes and all the, the rule book production and all of that. And basically, so Louis, when I met him in early December, it was the same kind of thing. Well, we can pay you a little bit and we can give you some stock for the rest. And, you're willing to do that. Well, Louis was a struggling, he was going to go to, I think he was going to go to medical school originally, but then decided, no, he really wanted to be an artist. And he had done a Sprocket Man comic book at Stanford for bicycle safety. And he was doing little odd art jobs while working, I think, as a phlebotomist at that point, and just to pay the bills. And he must have been only a year or two out of Stanford. And so when I met him, he was like, sure, I can do this. So it's like, okay, fine. We'll pay. I think the first deal was we paid him $500 in cash and $500 in stock to do all the work that we needed done. And it was something like that. And then where did you get this stuff printed? Well, guess what? His cousin had a print shop.
Oh,
So
Jesus.
in the area. So we went and used Robert's A&A printers. And in fact, we ended up using A&A printers for, again, 80-90% of our printing for the rest of SSI. So all this stuff came about very early on due to these little connections that you can trace back to Amdahl or my uncle or and so on. And I didn't mention that the connection with Tripp went on because when Tripp came to meet us, the venture capital guy wanted to invest in us, but they didn't really want to invest in me as president. They wanted me as design guy or R&D guy. They wanted to have a business person, so they wanted, and he said, well, I'd want Tripp to be president of SSI, or whatever it is it's going to be. And my uncle was like, no, you don't need the money, let's just do it ourselves. And Tripp said, well, okay. He wouldn't have left Apple anyway because he had 3 years of stock options. And he said, look, I've got 3 years of stock options coming due, and I'm going to stay at Apple until those come due. And then I'm going to leave and I'm going to go start my own game company. But in the meantime, I'll be happy to be on your board of directors if you want, because you can take advantage of my contacts and I'll be able to stay more in touch with what's going on by being on your board of directors. So Trip Hawkins was one of the original board of directors for SSI.
Oh, wow. And did he stay on after he founded EA?
No, what happened was 2 years later, when he started to prepare to start EA, he resigned from our board, and then he resigned from Apple, and that was about 81 or 82. I guess by
Mm.
81, I think. So we basically had him, I think, for 2 years. And then, ultimately, he ended up getting Danny Button away from us for Seven Cities of Gold, among other things. And there's a whole story of, what went on there, which, which is sort of an interesting, but basically,
Lay it on me if you can.
ultimately, Tripp was great in the early days, and Tripp would show up at our board meetings about 15 minutes late and carrying a sack McDonald's fries and a burger and into the board meeting because he was always constantly on the move and busy and late, but he was really helpful. And one of the first things he did was he got us the warranty list for the Apple computer at that point in December, which was about 30,000 people,
Oh,
and
wow.
we were able to mail to the Apple to warranty list. And then The other thing he did was he gave me a complete, he gave me a sheet. I remember I had on my wall for a while, which had all the distributors, the main distributors in the country. And this was just stuff he was doing, not just because he was on the board. They're trying to proselytize the Apple computer. So obviously anything that brings software to the Apple is good for them. And anything that gets distribution of software, because they're looking for the killer app, right? They're looking for reasons that people are going to buy these computers. So this was, he probably would have done this stuff for me, whether he was on the board or not, but it was obviously, good to have him there and to be able to help us, get some of that information early on. Well, anyway, a couple of years later, when he went off to start EA, we had a first right of refusal on Dan Button for future projects. He had done Computer Quarterback, which was a big success for us and for him. And he had done Citron Masters, and I'm trying to remember if there was, and he did Cartels and Cutthroats. He did a business game, which is great fun. Ultimately, got used by a college, converted into a textbook game. So he did a few games for us, and we had first right of refusal on his future. And Tripp was running around trying to lock up the best talent in the industry, and he thought Dan Button and Dan and his small group, Ozark Softscape, was one of the best talents out there, and he wanted to get Dan. And so we basically ended up in a bidding war in a way over Dan on his next game, what would be his next game. And I actually, and this went on when I flew to Houston. He was in Arkansas. I flew to Houston for a conference, a PC conference where we were selling our games. We had a booth, and Dan and his brother came and helped us man the booth and sell our games, right? Because at that point we would get help from whoever was, close, and that was relatively close for him. So he came, and here we were, and at the same time, at that conference, he was meeting with one of the EA's producers about doing a game for them. So he was literally helping us man the booth while he was negotiating a deal with Tripp's company, and we had the first right of refusal. And basically, I just kept saying, well, make an offer, and we're clearly interested in whatever Dan does. So we're going to want to see the offer that you're going to make, and we'll tell you if we match it or not. And this is where I made a mistake. I think ultimately, I think at some point Tripp came to me and said, "Hey, I'll give you some stock in EA. I'll give SSI stock in EA if you give us Dan Button. You basically, you don't execute your first right of refusal, and I, probably being stupid, or didn't think that was a good way to go, because I felt like I was selling Dan, and I didn't feel like I had a right to sell Dan. And so, in trying to figure out, getting stock at EA for Dan, it just didn't seem right. So I don't remember a lot of it, but I remember not feeling right about it and thinking, okay, let's just play it normal and make the offer and so on. And ultimately they structured it in a way that we couldn't meet it, which we kind of saw that coming anyway. But because Tripp was well financed by Brooke Byers and the people that the guy who didn't finance me because it was too small of a deal, by the time Tripp came along, it was a huge potential market. And Brooke Caulfield, Perkins, and Byers, or whatever, they ended up being the venture capital that went behind Tripp. So Tripp had money. He was going out there and basically offering big money. So what he did was he made an offer where there was a huge advance and royalties, against the advance. We couldn't match the advance. We never had that kind of money. So,
Gotcha.
So we lost them, and I always think, well, I could have had EA stock if I had played it right.
Yeah, but sometimes, being the moral high ground is its own reward, right?
Yeah, that's right. So, and then of course we had a long history with EA that came in later, where we ended up having to sue them over something, and then within a year of that, we ended up selling a piece of our company to them, and So, the
Oh,
Trip
okay.
Hawkins relationship was you know, a complicated one, but we found ways to work together ultimately and make it work for both sides. So it was good. And we
Well,
were very lucky to have to meet. I mean, I consider myself very lucky to have met Trip early on like that, and he was really a huge factor in those early days.
and I'm gonna have to come back to you on that lawsuit. Was that about a particular game or?
It was, yeah, it was about Questron.
Ah, okay. Then before we get to Questron, a little bit further back, what was it like distributing a game in 7980?
Oh,
Uh, b-
it was pretty wild west. I mean, you'd go into computer. We had the Computerland store, and at one corner and across the street there was the San Antonio Hobby Shop, which was one of the big war game stores. So I was literally, going in to San Antonio Hobby, would you buy these games, showing them the game, and I sold 2 copies there, and then I went into San Antonio. Into Computerland across the street, and I showed him the package, and the guy, like, he looked at it, and then he went. He said, "Hold on a second." He went and he made a phone call, and he came back, and I had a price sheet that said, if you buy 1 to 49 as a dealer, you get, X amount off, and if you buy 50 or more, you get a bigger discount. That was intended for distributors. Well, the Computerland guy basically said, "I'll take 50." So I was like,
wow.
whoa. And it turned out he was buying for the all 8 Computerlands they had in the Bay Area. He basically had a deal with the other ones that if they came across something, they could, they would sell to each other or whatever. So he was basically making a deal where he was buying the 50 and figuring to sell them to the other Computerland stores. So
Nice.
yeah, so that I was very happy with that. So we did our big mass mailing in January, and we started getting customers from around the country, buying direct. And initially, we thought this is the other thing. Initially, we thought we would be like SPI, we would be 90% mail order sales and 10% retail. And it turned out that there was also there were a couple of different distributors. The biggest one was in located in Davis, California. What was it? I think it was called California Pacific, and he was just sort of starting up distributing software. And he jumped on the bandwagon and grabbed our stuff, and he started distributing it. And then there were some war game store distributors that I got a hold of. So it was a combination of some chain stores that Trip knew about that were Apple dealers and calling them. And I was just getting on the phone calling these guys, and then calling the games store distributors, who I found a list of those from the somehow, and basically, just trying to hawk the game. And California Pacific, I think I didn't know about them, or they came to us or something, and they started buying in quantity. And I'd say within, well, almost immediately with the 50 sales to Computerland, we were 90% retail and 10% mail order.
Nice.
So it was the reverse of what we expected.
And just out of curiosity, how long did it take before Computerland ordered a second shipment?
Oh, geez, I don't remember, but they sold pretty well. So I would guess they were back. I mean, it wasn't immediate or anything, but I know they were back, within 6 months or something. I'm sure with more, but it wasn't like they were flying off the shelf either, because you have to realize that there were so few computers out there.
Hmm.
So the total. I mean, back in the early days, we sort of had the average game would sell 3,000 copies. And Computer Bismarck, I think over its 8 or 9 or 10 year life, because it went on for a long time, probably sold, I could look it up, but I think 7 or 7,500 copies, something like that.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah, it was not like huge copies. Remember, the whole Apple warranty list was 30,000 people. So, in theory, there were only 30,000 computers out there when we started selling.
Yeah. And so when you're, yeah, and I've got Moby Games open right now, taking a look at the SSI release schedule.
Hmm.
So that first year, according to what they've got listed, let me just see if I can my math skills are still what they need to be.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, in 1980, we've got 4 SKUs coming up: Computer Napoleonics, Computer Bismarck, Computer Conflict, and Computer Air Combat.
Mm-hmm.
N-
And
Now,
then and also Computer Quarterback, and that was the other one. So it was Bismarck, then Ambush, Computer Ambush, then Napoleonics and Quarterback. When we produced Napoleonics and Quarterback in September, that's when we turned profitable. So we'd
oh,
been losing
really?
money until September, and then as soon as we released the third and fourth game, that month we went profitable, and then we were profitable ever after that. And then we released Conflict and Air Combat. So it was 6 games in the first year.
Gotcha. And since what was the dynamic with those additional titles? I mean, was it easier than to get access to the stores? Would they order multiples of the multiple games from you at once, or was it still a game by game basis?
Yeah, no, it certainly helped to have a set of games, and so when we found new distributors or new distributors came online, they would be buying all of them. Of course, it's the latest product is the one that's selling the most, but you'd have in those later on. Of course, the industry got to where shelf life was only a couple months for any product, but early in those early years, you could have a product on the shelf for years, literally. And so you might have Computer Bismarck out there still selling in some of these stores, especially as there got to be more and more software specific, stores. They'd be there for many years. So
Wow.
clearly, your biggest sales came from the new release, though. And then if you had something like Quarterback, we sold everything at $60 until Quarterback was $40. That was our mass market price, and that sold so many more copies than the other games. And I'm looking at the sales numbers here. I have total sales per title for Quarterback. Yeah, 30,000, 31,000. So over the multiple computers, because ultimately Quarterback came out on Commodore and Atari. So on the Apple, though, Computer Quarterback sold 14,000 copies. So that compared to, the typical war game of maybe 3,000, or Bismarck, which sold, I see, 7,900. I just pulled the number out here,
Wow.
the spreadsheet out. So Quarterback, although it was sold for $40 instead of 60, was a big seller. That was a big success for us. And Computer Baseball the next year, which happened to be done by the same guy who did Computer Air Combat, that sold also, big numbers. So the sports games were huge. And I, the thing is, when I started SSI, I did it for the war game, but I actually, as I told you, I played sports games, just like Trip
Hmm.
designed a sports game at Harvard, a football game. And so, but I played sports games, I played political games, I played business games, I played, any kind of strategy game, right? Is what I enjoyed. And I always thought, let's just make, all these kinds of games. I mean, I was very happy when we got the football game in. It was right up my alley. I loved it, and let's do that. And then when football happened, then that led to, Charlie came in with Air Combat, and then did baseball. And with football doing so well, we obviously thought baseball would do well too.
Yeah.
So we were making every kind of strategy game, and then we started even getting into some of the sort of not role playing games, but some fantasy or science fiction like Shattered Alliance and so on.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, we're talking 1980, 81, 82, 83 here. This is obviously a time when it's before the console gaming crash.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of computer game publishers at this time, Sierra, for example, start to invest in console games. And even though they were, for example, Sierra was an adventure game company, suddenly they're buying the license to do Frogger for the 2600 and things
Mm-hmm.
like that. Were you ever tempted to move away from strategy games on computers and try to take a piece of that pie, so to speak?
No, because not in the early days, because the games we were doing didn't make sense on console.
Hmm.
Uh, and then the crash happened so quickly, and Louis was involved in that because he was doing work for Activision at the time. So, and Activision was part of that first crash.
Yeah.
And so we saw it firsthand, and yeah, it was pretty bad for the people who were in that business. And the other thing was those games, you had to make the cartridges, and it took capital. We didn't have that. So the most we could do is license something. Nobody was going to license one of our strategy games for console. They were,
Gotcha.
they just weren't right. I mean, the baseball and football game, they were probably doing console, as best they could. I don't know if they could do the hard stat stuff at that point, but they, were probably looking at making baseball, and football games. So yeah, we didn't have that opportunity. That came around later, the second wave with the Nintendo and so on.
Yeah. So, so you got the console crash in 83. You guys are continuing on and just have this very expansive library of titles. I mean, just looking at 83 here, you've got at least 10, 12 titles coming out. So what was the strategy? I mean, were you just taking a look at what was coming in? Was there a saturation point in the
Yeah,
market where you said, okay, more than this is too much?
yeah. No, we never got to the point where it was too much, other than on a per release. Probably we were trying not to do more than a couple of titles a month, just because of the effort. I mean, in 80 by 83, 82, 83, I remember there was something. I think I would always tell Chuck, who became head of R&D. He was one of our outside authors who ultimately we hired in, and then he became head of R&D. But at that point, when he first came in to help me out, I was doing like 18 games I was developing at the same time, over a course of
Wow.
a year. So it was a lot of work. And it was a lot, and I loved it because I played the test of the games at night, so that was my night job, was doing that. But clearly it was too much, and we needed help, and we grew, and we had some people come in, like Chuck, and but it was more a matter of absolutely what came in, what got submitted to us, and we would look at what was being submitted to us, what we thought we could work with or help people, complete, and what wasn't good enough to make it. And it was basically, we thought it was something that we could do. We jumped on it, and we tried to figure out how to get it done as soon as we could. And as far as the internal development, there was very little internal development. The first internal development that, other than there, I mean, there was Bismarck and Ambush, and so John Lyon was doing something. Ed Williger, I don't think he did anything after Ambush. So that was basically just, he was one game, and John, if I remember, John did a few games with us, and then we hired in somebody who ultimately became best man at my wedding, Paul
Hmm.
Murray, and he got hired in when he graduated from school, and he was going off for his he was an ROTC, so he had to go to do his 6 months active duty or whatever after he got out of college. And we basically decided, okay, this is what you should work on, so while you're away, start work on this if you can. And he ended up doing the Warp Factor for us, which was an early big success. It was a sci-fi, Star Trek, Star Wars type, game.
Hmm.
And so we had Paul come in, and he did that. So we had a little bit, we always had one or two people inside to do something. But like I said, it was 90% external design product. So we developed them, but we didn't code them. And 90% distributed through stores instead of 10% mail order. And those were both flip percentages from what we expected in the business plan.
Gotcha. And so you're getting these titles in, and like you said, how as you'd have to do some kind of extra polish, I'm guessing, on most of them to get them to where you need them to be.
Right.
How big was that investment? And I'm guessing at some point the one man productions being sent in weren't enough anymore. Uh, s- so But yeah, how big was the investment to keep it going? You said you had an R&D department. What were they doing?
Yeah, well, basically the R&D department initially was me and then ultimately Paul and came in and we would be testing other people's games. I mean, we might have trying to remember when we got our first testers exactly, but there really wasn't much of an R&D department. It was John and Ed and Paul and me, and then I'm trying to think if we had, when I know Chuck came in around 83, and I'm not sure if we had anybody else. See, Chuck met Dave Landry, and Dave Landry was a programmer, and Chuck had design ideas, and the two of them were working together while they both had day jobs, and they submitted the early games, Battle of Shiloh and Tigers in the Snow,
Okay.
and when we made the deal for them in '81, Chuck was basically able to do a lot of that development work that I was doing. He would do them on their products, and then I ended up hiring him in like 83, I'd say, maybe early 83. And that's when we started to have a quote R&D department, because he basically would be what I was. I was the producer of all games until that time. Now he could produce some of the games, I could produce some of the games, and we could hire some other people to go under him eventually. And so that got fleshed out. But even as late as 83 or 84, it was probably, we'd have maybe a couple of testers, part-time guys. Sometimes we got, like Keith Broers, I think he came in as a tech support person. We had to have people, who can answer tech support calls. Now, I got Gary Grigsby, who's my current partner in 2x3 Games, because to do games for us, because he called in with a question on Torpedo Fire, one of our early games, and I answered the phone because I was our tech support back in 1981. And when I answered the phone and talked to him about Torpedo Fire, he also said he was working on he'd been fooling around working on a game on the Guadalcanal campaign. And I said, oh, absolutely, send it to us when you have something. And that turned into the Guadalcanal campaign, and he became the most prolific war game designer probably ever. I mean, he's done 30, 35 games over
Wow.
the years. So that all came from that one phone call. But at that point, at some point, I couldn't do the phone calls anymore. I couldn't take all the tech support and develop all the games and do all this stuff. In fact, I think back, I don't know how I did it then, but I was young. And basically, Keith came in and he took tech support calls, and he was basically just a guy, out of high school and who had a lot of self-taught computer skills, and basically was able to answer questions on our games because he could play our games, learn them. He was a great gamer, I mean, a really good strategist. He could learn the games, and so he started doing that. So we started having these people in the company that could test the new games that were getting designed. So he, no doubt, when he wasn't answering phone calls, was probably testing our games, and that sort of got how we got things done back then.
And let's say somebody submitted a game for the Apple II, and you needed to get an Atari and a Commodore version done as well. Were those also farmed out to other people? Were they done internally, the ports?
What again? Usually, it happened in different ways. Like I think the Computer Ambush got converted to the Commodore by somebody who just did it on their own, and then contacted us. But that was rare. Sometimes the original designer got the ability to do it, and sometimes there were companies that were getting hired. Now that was one thing Chuck probably had a lot to do with early on, or he definitely did later on, was putting the different development groups in contact with each other and getting different development groups. I mean, over time, there were times when we had a group in India that did some development work, and then there were some U.S. companies that were doing these ports for us. And what happened is some of the companies that were doing the ports ended up doing their own games eventually.
Ah,
So
okay.
I think Westwood Studios, which ultimately Command and Conquer, I think, came out of
Yes.
Westwood, and ultimately became, was bought by EA and all. They were doing games for us for a while, and I think going back, one of their first jobs may have been a port job for us on like Road Warrior or something, whatever the game title was. And I think Chuck got some of these groups to do ports, and then eventually they became their own studios that did work for us and for other people.
Very cool. So when you're doing releasing these games, uh, I'm trying to figure out how the projections for sales would work in order to calculate how much investment you can put into the game. So let's say you do an internal development
Mm-hmm.
because so how are you calculating the man hours? Are you calculating production
Yeah, it,
costs?
it, it wasn't until probably 5, 6, 7 years in, maybe as late as the D&D games, that we started doing pro formas and actually having here's a game we're proposing to do. Here's how many we think we're going to sell. This is how much work. It was probably a good 5, 6 years before we ever got to that point. And
Okay.
in so yeah, before that, it was simply, it was only a few games that we were working on at any one time internally. The most we'd ever work on is two at the same time. So it wasn't a big issue. It
Hmm.
was basically, what's the topic? What it was more a matter of what the guy was interested in doing, and whether we thought there was a interest in that topic. Then okay, yeah, let's do it. Is it doable? Whatever. And not a lot of thought going into, what's the best thing we could possibly do.
And
So.
and when somebody submitted a game, what were the standard conditions back in the day for licensing a title?
Well, we had to come up with our own. So I don't know how we did it, but the very first deal I remember with Dan Button, and it became the norm for the rest of our contracts for many years, was you got 10% on the first 1,000 copies, you got 15%. This is of what we got from the distributors.
Hmm.
You got 15% on from 1,000 to 3,000 sales, and you got 20% after 3,000. and and that just lasted forever. And why that we came up with that, I don't know. We came up with it because we lowered the royalties at the beginning, so to cover the costs of making the box and that kind of idea, the rule book. So we're going to pay you less than 20% for those first 3,000 copies, so we can cover some of the upfront costs out of your royalties, basically. But otherwise, you're basically getting 20% after that. If it got to 3,000, now of course, a lot, the assumption in the early day, we didn't know if we would get to 3,000. That was a guess. When we did that deal with Dan Button, which we probably did the deal in like April of or May of 1980. I had 3 months of sales of Bismarck, so I know our first press run was 1,000 copies, I think, 1,000 boxes, or maybe 2,000. I can't remember. And so 3,000 would have been more than we would have sold at that point. So I didn't know. Uh, and now this is where EA did it differently, because EA very quickly, when they did their first deals, and I saw it because the Danny Button deal was one of their first 8 games or so. Uh, their deal was, we're going to pay you a higher percentage, whatever that percentage was, and I don't know, I don't think it was 20, but it was maybe 15 or something for the first few thousand, and then it's going to go down, and it's going to go down. So ultimately, as you get over the initial 5 or 10,000 copies or whatever they had, and they had much bigger, numbers in mind too. It was going to be a lower percentage, so they wanted to make a bunch of money on it selling a ton, and
Yeah.
they were going to pay you less at that point. And so it was the totally opposite of what we were doing.
Yeah, well, yeah. So basically, if you were a developer of games, you wanted to try to get into SSI.
There weren't too many places to go. So like I said, in April of of 80, Dan had done one game I'd never heard of, and it sold like 200 copies or something, and he had done it in 1979, I think, and there just wasn't much. What happened was there was Epix, with automated simulations at the time, and there was Sierra Online, and there was Broderbund, and those were some of our competitors. But if you were a strategy war game, particularly serious strategy game, there we were at.
Yeah. And so you guys you had success with strategy games. Where do the role-playing games, where does that come in? Where they simply submitted? I'm looking here at the Moby games just to remind myself. The first one that's listed as a role-playing game is Galactic Adventures in '83.
Yeah, so we had that was a submission to us, and there was Galactic Gladiators, which actually was in June of '82, according to this, and then Galactic Adventures was Galactic Gladiators was a tactical combat game, a simple tactical combat game, and then Galactic Adventures was sort of a pseudo adventure wrapped around these tactical battles, and so those were from a guy in Berkeley, I think, actually. And I'm thinking, when did Questron? I'm looking for Questron here.
Is 80? It's the next year. It's 84.
84, right? Questron was another submission. The Dougherty brothers. There were two guys who worked on it and submitted it, and we liked it. And so it was basically just keeping in line with whatever comes in that looks good that people can get addicted to. let's publish it, and we published it. Now we had a problem with Questron that we really walked into and had no idea that we had this problem, and that the problem was that they had submitted their game to Origin. I'm not sure if it was called Origin Systems back then or not, but basically the Ultima Online, or not Ultima Online, Ultima. Yeah, the early Ultima, games, and so what was the name even before that? Lord British, right?
No, Lord British is the moniker for Richard Garriott, the main designer. But right. Origin Systems was always the name of the company.
Right. Okay. So they had basically, I think, submitted their game to them, and they were I think they were told, "Oh, this is too much like our game" or something like that. And so, oh no, I know what they did. They submitted it. That's right. They submitted it to Broderbund, and Broderbund told them, "Oh, we think this game is too close to the Ultima games, so we can't do that." And either that or the Origin people had talked to the Broderbund people. I'm not sure what. And I didn't play those games, for one. I didn't know any of those games. So basically, we got the game in. I thought it was great. So we're all ready to go. We developed it. It didn't take very long. It was a few months, if that, probably to finish it up. And then we're set to publish it. And in January, our sales guy is showing it probably at CES, it must have been. And the Origin people walk by, or what did Origin publish through Broderbund initially?
No, no, the original agreement was with Sierra.
Oh, Sierra.
So,
okay.
Yeah, maybe so Richard Garriott got a deal with Ken Williams, and that didn't last long. Those two butted heads really bad. Okay. And then they started, I believe, publishing them. No, they don't start publishing themselves until a little bit later, quite a bit later. Yeah, but I don't know who was publishing them early. Yeah,
I think Broderbund may have been publishing them. It's possible.
It's possible. Sure. Yeah.
But so what happened was that basically whoever it was went up and saw our booth and saw Questron, and they said, "Wait a minute, that game is the game that we said, no, you can't, you can't do that game. And what are you guys doing with this game?" And so I went back to the guys who made it. I just remember, like I said, I called them the Dougherty brothers. That was their last name, and I can't remember the first name of the one I was dealing with. But anyway, uh, the short answer is we had a problem because they were basically saying you can't publish this game, and we had already printed all the packaging. We were ready to release this game, so at that point, the reason I think Broder Run was involved in this, well, it may have been Soft Talk Magazine, actually. Now that I think about it, uh, the people who published Soft Talk Magazine, I can't remember her name now, the woman who ran it, but she was, we'd always been in contact and had a good relationship with them, and somehow somebody got in and sort of alerted us as an intermediary, and we ended up making a deal with whoever the publisher was for the Origin product, and we ended up basically paying a royalty to them in order to publish Questron. But that deal, I mean, I have a scar on my hand to this day, literally because I was late, because I was negotiating this deal, and I was late getting up into the mountains for a weekend ski trip with a bunch of friends from SSI, and I had to put my chains on, and in the snowstorm I got stuck in that none of them got stuck in, and cut my hand because of it. And it was all because I was several hours late and got stuck in the snowstorm. And it was because I was negotiating this deal, 3 days before the game was coming out. And so it was not pleasant. I don't remember it fondly. I was very mad that these guys did this, basically, that they knew that this problem existed and they played dumb. They didn't say a word to us about it, and I had no clue. And maybe I should have had a clue, but I didn't know these games were out there, and that this game was like that too much, and ultimately how much, I don't know what the deal was in terms. I don't remember now. Like, was there a reason why? Was it just, did they just knock it off, or did they get somehow the code, and go into the code? And all I know is that I was able to make a deal for a small royalty percentage that made the company, that made Origin happy enough, and we were able to, deal with it. And I don't remember. I think I remember the Dougherty brothers were not happy at the time because I don't remember if we ended up if we split the royalties with them that we had to pay to Ultima, because they were unhappy, to pay for anything. Why should they have to pay for, something? So it wasn't pleasant. And anyway, that was Questron. The good news about Questron was it was a nice success, and it made us realize there was a whole, kind of adventure role-playing market that we could be involved in. And we actually got another game submitted to us called Fantasy by a nice guy who did a series of games with us. And at the same time, we got that adventure game, Gemstone Warrior, sort of action-y, not adventure, but action kind of pseudo adventure game. And though with all those games, with Questron, Gemstone Warrior, and Fantasy coming out, suddenly SSI was a fantasy player, of different kinds of games, not just a war game or sports game, political game player. And at the same time, Paul Murray and Keith Broers, who were two internal people, by this point, Keith, self-taught, but it was basically starting to program stuff. And we thought he and Paul and Keith were both big role-playing gamers, D&D players, all kinds of role-playing game systems, and they wanted to do their own game. And we thought, yeah, these fantasy games sell better than the war games, so let's do a few of those. So they said, look, we want to do our own tactical combat-based, role-playing game. So, okay, fine. So they went off and they did Wizard's Crown, and I think and a sequel to that. So by this point in the 84, 85, 86, we were generating those different role-playing games.
Yeah. And were you guys, since you were developing those internally, was there any talk about creating a standard game engine to use for multiple different games or to build off of, or through the,
Well, in a
yeah.
way, we had a tool. We had a thing called Hex Pack, and then and Square Pack, and I'm trying to remember which one was first. That Keith ended up writing, and he wrote it to basically as a graphics tool to have a hex-based engine games and um, Square-based, map games. And so HexPack and SquarePack were tools that he wrote. They became really important for Gary because Gary and he wrote those probably pretty early, like in '83, and then basically Chuck's partner Dave Landry started doing games using it. Gary started doing games using it. So they were basically making hex grid war games using this pack. I don't know if Keith, I assume Keith used some of that in what he did in Wizard's Crown.
Okay. And so you were using that for the strategy games, but you could also use it for the role-playing games. And this brings us up to around 86, 87. And this is already the time when we've had the 8-bit computers for quite a while on the market. You got the 16-bit computers popping up. So DOS is getting better. The Amiga and Atari ST are starting to pop on the scene. What was and the NES is sort of out there. There's no real. It's not really a player yet in the United States,
Right.
but it's already out there. Did you guys have any kind of plan for what comes after the 8-bit lines are over with?
Well, by that point, we had gotten pretty good at porting. So all the 6502 based stuff, Commodore 64 was really the biggest selling. I mean, at that point, by 86, 87, Commodore 64 was probably doubling or tripling the Apple sales on the bigger products, maybe on the mass market products. On the mass market products, it was at least as big. Atari might have been like half as big as the Apple and the Commodore in most cases, and the Atari going down. And then and then the PC came in, like you said, and that was really hard to work with. But we started getting, some games on the PC, but it was spotty. And then the Amiga and the ST came in, and it wasn't clear to anybody what was going to win. And at one point, there were games going on 6 SKUs. I mean, we had Apple, Atari, Commodore, Amiga, ST, and PC.
Yeah. Well, I mean, a perfect example here is I'm looking at Road War 2000 from 1986.
Yeah.
And we've got a list of Amiga, Apple II, Apple II GS, which actually was a whole different system almost.
Right, right.
Atari ST, Commodore 64, DOS, PC 88, PC 98, and Sharp X1.
Right.
So, and now those last 3 are basically Japan-only machines.
Right.
How did that come about?
No, they were all licensed. Our sales overseas were licensed to we would have we had a distributor in Japan. In fact, initially it was somebody we met through Broderbund. That's why we had a good in with Broderbund in that sense. So even though we were competitors at that time, we could be competitors with people and still be working together in a way because it was such a small industry and certain, you get along with certain people, you don't get along with other people. It's kind of the way it works. And with Broderbund, because they had an early end in Japan and they had this guy doing distribution, they helped him take him around and introduce him to other people. And so we were doing distribution through the same distributor. And that's no doubt, somebody, he came to us and licensed some things for the Japanese computers. There wasn't so much of that in the UK, although we had a company. By that point, we probably had US Gold was the company in England that was selling our things. And so there was a little bit of these oddball computers that might get licensed. But generally, most of the stuff was the ones you just mentioned. and really the meat of the market was still the Apple and the Commodore at that point. And
Yeah.
I mean, I can look at or you say Road War.
Road War 2000. Yeah.
Yeah, there's Road War Europa. I'm looking at, I have a list here
Oh
of
yeah.
SKUs. Yeah,
Yeah.
so Road War sold 7,000 on the Apple, sold 13,000 on the Commodore. Wow, okay, this is a lot. 5,800 on the ST. That's a big number. And
Wow.
5,800 on the Amiga. Yeah, those are big numbers. So that shows you that Road War was sort of a pseudo mass market like Road Warrior, and it got out at the right time on all the different platforms. So
Yeah,
even the
80,
two, yeah,
86 would have been Mad Max time. So
yeah. So it did well, and the PC even had 8,800 in March
wow.
'87 came out and sold 8,800. So there's a case where you've got one, two, three, four, five. I count five SKUs that all had over 5,000 copies each.
Wow.
So that was a lot. So we were getting good at putting things on multiple platforms, and it all depended usually on either one, whether the design company had the ability themselves to do it, and we try to help them. And SquarePack made that a lot easier, by the way, or HexPack, for the guys doing the war games. And
Yeah.
then, or they would go and find somebody like with Road War. I could swear that's Westwood did Road War or Road War Europa, and they did a lot of those ports.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, I was actually just looking up Westwood as well, and I do believe they did at least some of the ports. Yeah, it looks like they did the Amiga, the GS, and the ST, so the 16-bit ports.
right. Right. So
Yeah.
we saw the business coming in. We didn't know if it was, they were expensive, the computers. The Commodore 64 was the only really, really cheap one of the
Hmm.
bunch. And it was driving, anything mass market would sell much more on the Commodore 64. I mean, by 87, War Game Construction Set came out on the Commodore 64 and sold 37,000 copies for us. And
Wow.
the Apple versions, no, it didn't even come out on the Apple. Huh. Maybe it came out on the Atari and sold 7,000. So the Commodore 64 at 36,000 was, that's a big number.
Yeah.
So you can see that C64 was really for us the big market, and these others were nice, but they weren't replacing it.
Mm.
And even the IBM was starting to, show some signs that someday it might actually do something. So we sold 9,000 IBM War Game Construction Sets, but that wasn't until '88 that those came out.
Gotcha. Now, speaking of this, so in 86, we've got a much more mature market. Like you said, there's these mass computers. What is the mix on retail at this point? How much of it could you sell through catalog? And how much was going through retail outlets, and how was that divided up? I mean, was it mass retailers like Sears? Was it the mom and pop computer stores?
It was always like 10% mail order at best, and we would do promotions and mailers and things to try to boost up our direct mail. And we did actually big mailings of our catalog every couple of times a year, and we would try to get some, but it was never more than 10% of the business. So most of it was dealers. Now, at some point in there, the stores like the software, et ceteras,
Hmm.
and I don't remember what the other company names were now,
Oh,
but Electronic
Egghead and
Boutique,
yeah.
and yeah, and those stores became big, and they had their own distribution chains. There was always a distributor in the early years, the first 5, 6, 7, 8 years. There was always a distributor that was big, and there was one in LA, and I think Soft Cell maybe it
Yeah,
was. I don't.
soft sell.
And as I said, California Pacific was our very first one in Davis, but they never got to be that big. Soft Cell at one point, if they're who I'm thinking in LA, they became at one point like 50% of our business was going through them, which was
Wow.
really dangerous in a way. And ultimately, I think they did go under at some point, or something happened and there was some money that was definitely lost. But by then their percentage had gone down a lot. And you have to realize also that when you have the big distributors and everybody, that you start getting the issue of returns, because you sell it and they'll return them. I don't care. They didn't care what your return policy was. They're going to return them, and if you don't take them back, they're not going to pay you. And you may need to, you may want to get paid for your last things that you sold, but they're not going to take your new games unless you want them to take your new games. So you have to take back what they send you of the games that didn't sell. So, and that became more of an issue over time as dealers became, a bigger part of the business, and the dealers had less and less shelf space available, and shelf life went down to 3 or 4 months. And basically, if it didn't sell, it was coming back, and and that all accelerated to the point of, by 1992, it got really bad. But in these days, it wasn't a bad thing, but every so often you'd hit a dealer or a distributor who ran into problems, and you would be on the hook for whatever, they owed you. You might not get that money back.
Wow. Yeah, that would be a problem.
Yeah.
Now, in the early days, like you said, there were only a handful of companies, and basically you guys were the strategy company.
Mm-hmm.
By 86, 87, Commodore 64 is well established. There's some other systems on the horizon. Had any real competition to your market popped up by then?
There were different pieces of the market. So the sports games we did, and we did 4 of them, I think. They were really good in the first 3, 4, 5 years, and then EA killed us. Except for we did kill them, and we did beat them with Tony La Russa baseball in like '87. We beat Earl Weaver baseball, but basically we were out of that business because we couldn't compete with the graphics and the high-end stuff that they were doing in most cases, and they were covering the world with EA Sports. So that was that. As far as pure war games, which is where my heart is, I'm trying to think back, and there were a few people out there making some war games, but there was no SSI. We really were the Avalon Hill at that point. Back before there was strategy and tactics at SPI in the 60s, there was just Avalon Hill, and that's kind of what we were for 4 or 5 years. Avalon Hill actually put out some games early on, and they were lousy. And
I was about to say, yeah.
Yeah, and we offered Bismarck to them in August of 79 when I was first starting the company. I called them and I got blown off by Tom Shaw, their VP of the development, and basically, he didn't want to hear about what we were doing because he had 6 games in development and they were set. And I was just this kid out of college. I'm sure he thought I was, yeah, sure, you're going to do something, So, we actually also, I got blown off by Epics, automated simulations, because I saw automated simulation space game in Starfleet Orion in the San Antonio Hobby Shop. So I called them because they were right down the street, literally from where I live, practically, a couple miles. And I went over and I met with one of the guys. I can't remember which one, John Freeman or the other one. I can't remember. And I naively suggested
Jim Connolly.
Yeah, it was more the business guy. So I think it was Jim that I met with, and I basically sort of naively went over there and said, we were thinking about working on, we're working on this war game and thinking about doing war games, and I see you're doing something like it, and I'm doing all this data gathering now. Would you be interested in sharing any information? And he kind of listened, and ultimately it was like, no, I don't want to do anything with you, and basically it was like, okay. So that was my 2 contacts with competitors in August of 79, and that basically cemented me in the idea that, oh, okay, I have to go do this myself. I have to go publish these games. So
And it worked out
It worked
quite
out.
nicely.
Yeah, yeah. I can't say I'm unhappy about it. So
No.
uh, it was better that than they string us along or something, I guess. So and anyway, yeah.
Yeah.
So there were competitors. I'm trying to think who there was. 360 or that did some war games, but that might have been later. I'm trying to think. Nope, I can't think of anybody who actually tried to do war games quite like we did.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, and I don't remember anybody either, which is, it's kind of weird to think that one company had that much control over this one genre. But I
Yeah, but
mean,
it was only so big. The market size wasn't that big. You
hmm,
know, the war game, if you look at the war game piece of our business, it was probably, never more than $2 or $3 million or something like that in sales, maybe, if that. I mean, as we grew later on, there was always a sports game or of the role-playing games that came in 84, 85, 86 that I wouldn't say are war games. The Galactic Gladiators and Galactic
yeah,
Adventures and all that. They're not war games per se. And so if you just look at the historical war games, it's probably $1 to $2 million, through those early years.
gotcha. Yeah. And obviously, if closing out 87, that brings us to 88, where there's I mean, something that a lot of people will know, the non-war gamers know SSI as the D&D company. And so how did that deal come about?
That came about because our sales guy, Randy Brolight at the time, went to Gen Con, which was the big TSR run convention in Wisconsin every year, and he 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 had been going to the conventions, and he'd sort of been keeping in somehow with whether the D&D people, the TSR people, were thinking of licensing D&D. And I thought it came from him that ultimately he got wind of the fact that TSR was interested in licensing. So somehow that came about. And so we were always sort of connected to the role-playing business because we went to the Origins War Game Convention. We went to Gen Con perhaps to sell our board game, not board games, but our war games and our role-playing, computer games. They were a
Hmm.
good place to hit the target audience, right? And and we were all gamers, and the war gamers and D&D players overlap tremendously. So it was a natural fit. So anyway, Randy found out about this, and we we found out that yes, they were taking bids. They were interested in having people come and basically make an offer for licensing D&D. And so when we got that idea, we said, okay, what can we do? And on our side, we ended up with this idea that okay, it's not a one-off game. Let's think big here. So we thought about doing a whole line of role-playing games, and then we thought about doing a paper Dungeon Master's Assistant product that would help people who are playing D&D and use the computer to make their dungeon mastering easier. And then we also thought, hey, why not make an action game that has the D&D license brand to it that's just a shooter game of some kind and take advantage of the license. And we had the U.S. Gold Company in England that had experience making action games basically for the Commodore 64 kind of marketplace. And they were somehow, this idea came about. I don't know if Randy talking to them or them talking to us or whatever, but it came about that's what we were going to pitch. We were going to pitch three products. What became Pool of Radiance, the gold box, was one
Hmm.
line of games. The silver box games, which Heroes of the Lance, I think, was the series.
That was the
And,
first one, yeah.
yeah, and then the other it was the Dungeon Master's Assist product. So we had these 3 lines that we were going to go in with. So we went back to Wisconsin and we pitched them, and we made a big deal of it. It wasn't just, we didn't just send one person. It was like 5 of us went, and we pitched them, and they were kind of blown away by the fact that, well, one, we were war gamers and gamers, so we talked their language. So their technical people, their design staff people, and us, we got along right away because we were the same people basically. and all it took, I guess, in the end, and I didn't know this at the time, but it was the business side person, and it was basically the woman who had just taken over TSR from Gary Gygax within a couple of years of this. It was convincing her, I guess, that they wanted money. And I just saw something from some other interview being done about this, that it was basically they wanted a big advance. And in fact, when we made the deal, when we made our offer, I offered a huge royalty percentage, but not much money up front, because that's the way SSI did things. We didn't have a lot of money up front. So I'll give them more on the back end. And they basically said, no, we like you guys. We really, we'd like to do a deal with you, but we need a big guarantee up front, and, you can lower the royalty. So I think we went in thinking we might even give them 30% royalty. I could be wrong about that, but it was some outrageous number that had we done it, probably never would have worked. But in the end, I think we ended up offering them $500,000 or $1 million guarantee with a big chunk up front, and then 10% royalty, I think, was the royalty that they ended up getting. And what we did in order to make that deal possible was we went to Japan and we went to England, and we basically, US Gold was willing to sign up to make the game, and then they may have put up some money, I'm not sure, but at the company that we were dealing with or could deal with in Japan ended up licensing the products and put up a big bunch of money, in fact, for, I think, the Nintendo version. So basically, by licensing the Nintendo version of a game not yet done and getting the money coming in from that, we were able to pay the money out to TSR and guarantee we could come up with the money that they had. And that's how we were able to make the deal. And they were happy to make the deal with us over EA and Origin and somebody else. I don't remember what the other company was, but there were several that had all pitched them. But they had all pitched them on basically, as far as I understand, they'd all pitched them on basically one product. Yeah, we'll do a D&D game for you.
Oh yeah, and that wouldn't have done the license or the brand any good.
Right.
Yeah. Yep. And it worked out wonderfully because, I mean, well, and you probably have the sheets there. The obviously the gold box games have become a classic. Now that game engine that was used for the gold box games, was that an internal development, or did you guys have an external team develop that?
That's the interesting thing. This is where I saw Chuck just answering some other questions in an interview that made it sound like they got some engine underlying technology possibly from Westwood on that product. I'm not sure that is true on the gold box game, because the gold box, we may have gotten it. We may have gotten the 3D part of that gold box game technology from them. And so there was the 3D element, wasn't there? And then there was the little window, or you're walking through it. And then there was the combat part where you
exactly
with the pieces. The combat part was probably right out of Wizard's Crown, and probably right out of Square Pack and Hex Pack, and stuff that was already developed for Wizard's Crown. And Keith was the lead programmer on it. So on Pool of Radiance. So as far as I remember, he was the head guy, and it was no doubt just an extension. That's why we thought we could do it so well, so quickly, easily, because we already had done it basically. And So, but that 3D window probably, that must be what Chuck is saying that we got from Westwood. So that's,
Yeah,
possible.
because I'd heard that also that Westwood was somehow involved, and I wasn't sure if they had just done the 68,000 ports of the game engine. What was the lead platform for that, for the
It was
gold
C6,
box?
yeah, C64. The
C64.
C64 was, by that point, the C64 had become by far the best seller of everything. And to give you an idea, Questron 2 had come out in early 88, it looks like, and sold 20,000 on the Commodore and about 8,000 on the Apple. So the C64 was we knew that was the main lead machine. That was the
Hmm.
mass market. So if you could do a mass market game on the C64, that's where you were going to sell, bunches.
So, and that's actually an interesting comparison. So, Questron 2 is moving 20,000 units on the C64. How many units does Pool of Radiance move on that system?
According to this, 107,000 as of June 94.
Wow, that's a lot of units.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yep.
And
Well,
and
the total across all SKUs, because the IBM ultimately became, this is where the IBM now became huge, was 265,000 as of June.
really?
As of 1994, we had sold 265,000 Pool of Radiances total. 80 and 102,000 were IBM.
Wow. Okay. So
So it
that is a lot
shifted.
more.
So C64 was the main SKU, but we released the PC in December versus August. So what's 5 months later?
Yeah.
And over those next few years, the PC equaled the Commodore.
Wow. And well, by the end of the gold box run, the Commodore 64 wasn't even an issue anymore. That fell away fairly quickly. Or at
Yeah,
least within the next year or two.
yeah, I can see. Let's see. I can't. Let's
Curse of
see.
the Azure Curse of the Azure Bonds was still C64. Dragons of Flame was uh,
See,
Champions of Krynn was still C64. Okay, a
yeah.
little bit
Oh,
later than I thought.
here's Death Knights of Krynn.
Yeah.
And so what was that? The second or third of the Dragonlands?
Death Knights of Krynn, I think, is the second of the Dragonlance. Yeah.
Okay, so that came out in March 91, and according to this, it sold 38,000 IBM and 14,000 Commodore by 94, which is probably most. So it's drastically fallen off.
Dramatically, yeah.
Yeah,
And
and in fact, by that point, the gold box game, it was losing its steam, it lost its steam. So
yeah. Well, and that's now an interesting question. So you get the deal with TSR, and you have these three lines of product. Now, the gold box games last into the early 90s, so they've got about 3-4 years on them as viable product. And the action-oriented games. So you've got your Heroes of the Lands, Dragons of Flame, Hills Far, and so forth.
mhm.
What was the general strategy or thought process on that?
Well, we were never as happy with those games because they honestly they weren't as high quality as
Hmm.
as we thought, at least as the gold box game. They clearly weren't of the light. They weren't as true to the license of the role playing. There's just action
Hmm.
games, and they were so action games compared. I mean, the Heroes of the Last might not have been that bad. I don't really remember. I mean, I'm looking at the sales, and it sold 88,000 copies at over all the different platforms, and IBM quite a bit, half of it IBM practically, which is
Really?
interesting. Yeah, more 38,000 IBM and only 31,000 Commodore. for Heroes of the Lands. So, which is interesting.
Very
But
interesting.
so you can see it's 250,000, 260,000 Pool of Radiance, 80,000 Heroes of so much different. And I think the second one was even less, and Hillsfar was 78,000 copies. So they were sort of disappointments in a way. I mean, they weren't big disappointments. They were disappointments compared to Pool of Radiance, which was this amazing product for us. So it's sort of unfair to compare to.
Yeah.
So they certainly had their place in the role of everything we were doing. Eye of the Beholder was really the product that came along that everybody felt really good about. It's like, okay, this is just like Pool of Radiance is. This is something special as a game.
Yeah.
And different. And I'm looking at Eye of the Beholder, and according to this, Eye of the Beholder, which was basically, this says PC. I don't know if it must have come out.
It was only on DOS, Amiga, and ST.
Oh, there we go. Yeah. Okay. I'm looking at the clue book sales. Wow, 55,000 clue books, right?
Wow.
So, yeah, can you believe that? So the game itself.
Wait, did it sell more clue books than actual software?
No. The game on the PC, it sold 110,000 on the PC and another 16 on the Amiga. So and then yeah, so 125,000 copies.
Does that include international sales?
No, these are not. Well, yes and no. Yes, if we shipped game boxes over to them, which I think we did, it would not include like the Japanese version, if there was such a thing, because they would make yeah, we didn't. I don't think we shipped games to them, did we? I'm trying to think.
I don't think so. I'm trying to remember if Eye of the Beholder. I was actually living in Germany when Eye of the Beholder came out, and it was a massive success. The Amiga version came out a little bit later, but yeah, I knew quite a few people who had copies of that just because there wasn't a lot of role-playing games on the system to begin with.
Right.
And so that's why I was just wondering if that 15,000 number included that. For the US, it sounds perfectly accurate because the Amiga was a dying platform, but in Europe, it was still the lead platform for gaming at the time.
It really depends. The US Gold, I think, they were our distributor through most of this period, and I think they may have repackaged on the bigger. I think by US Gold time they were repackaging and making their own European package version, so they weren't US versions. So yes, I don't think these unit numbers would include international.
Gotcha.
So there were, before US Gold, like back in the early days, we would ship games to a French distributor. We had Ubisoft was actually our French distributor at one point, believe it or not.
Oh, cool.
And yeah, well, they owed us $12,000. They never paid when they stopped being a distributor. I was really mad. We never got to collect that money, and then ultimately they ended up owning SSI at the end of the day. So they still owe themselves $12,000. So anyway, I think we would ship them games, and then they would they would basically use those game boxes, but they were very small quantities.
Yeah.
So
well, curiously enough, speaking of Eye of the Beholder, I don't know if you've seen this, but there's a guy who's actually porting, I believe he's from Sweden. He's doing a 1-to-1 port of Eye of the Beholder onto the Commodore 64 right now.
Wow.
Yeah, it looks impressive. It really does.
Yeah.
And now, just out of my own personal curiosity, my favorite game from you guys at around this time was actually Dragon Strike.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, what can I say? I love the idea of using the stats and the flight simulator at the same time.
Right.
How much did that actually move?
Do you have a date when that came out?
1990.
Oh, here it is, Dragon Strike. Yeah, we sold 23,000 on the PC and another little over 5,000 on the Amiga and a little over 5,000 on the C64. So wow. 34,000 total.
Oh, not a huge hit.
No, it was not. It was disappointing, and part of it was, I remember we all thought this was such a great concept game, and then when we got the actual how it worked out in practice, it just didn't work that well. And I don't remember
Mm.
if it was because it was kind of boring and what the choices you could do, or if it was that the AI wasn't very good, or if it fell into certain patterns, or if it was just the the technology wasn't fast enough for it. I can't remember.
It was made. I played it on the Amiga. Years later, I actually got to play the Commodore 64 version, which was, yeah, the C64 version was basically unplayable.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
the Amiga version, the first half of the levels were still somewhat playable on a standard machine, but later on, the missions got so complicated through the geometry and stuff that it was like playing a slideshow, unfortunately.
Right. Okay. So that's
Yeah.
it. We had several games. I mean, we go back to Computer Ambush in 1980 as virtually unplayable out of the box. I mean, if you play with the scenario that had 4 men against 2 men and you were willing to wait for 5 minutes, you could play it. But
Oh, wow.
basically, you try to play 10 on 10, you could, go 10 hours, then it'll probably crash. But you couldn't play it. And when the guy who ported it to the Commodore, it suddenly became this amazing game because he put it in assembly language and it
Mhm.
was amazing. And ultimately they backported it to the Apple in assembly language and it was incredible. Well, we've had this problem with mini games over the years where it's like this is way ahead of the technology. It's not gonna be very good. Well, we got to ship it anyway. So
I hear you. I hear you. And that brings up another question. So, are you guys still uh, a standalone, privately owned company at this point?
well, SSI,
Yeah,
SSI,
SSI around 1990. Yeah.
yeah, we. What happened was in '87 when as soon as we made the D&D deal, we turned
Yeah.
around and well, in early '88, we were getting ready to come up to Pool of Radiance coming out in the summer. We sold 20% of our stock to EA, so 20% of us was sold to EA, and as part of that deal, we agreed to become an affiliated label, and
Okay.
for some number of years, or as long as they own any stock in us. And there was a way we could buy back the stock based on a formula of our sales, but
Mm.
basically, as long as they owned any of us, we were stuck being an affiliated label. At the time, we liked it for two reasons. One, we got 20% of the money, which we didn't actually take into SSI. We just uh, cashed out all of our stockholders at that point because up until then we had been in business for 8 years or nine years, and nobody had sold any stock. It
Oh,
was a
wow.
private company. So we had been having people that bought stock. We had stock options people could buy, but there was no way to sell stock. So by doing this, we basically got 20% of the sales of everybody's shares and went to EA, and that money went to them. So we all got a cash payout basically at that point. And that helped me buy my house, so I was happy. So and basically, but the downside, and then the positive of that, the other positive was we thought even though we had our own sales force of 2 people, and we had been used to selling, we thought, oh, we want to be part of EA because they will sell this like crazy. They can sell it better than we can. It's D&D, and we should take advantage of that. That probably was not necessary. We probably could have sold 99% of what they sold,
Yeah.
honestly. And they took a chunk, obviously, as being the distributor. They got a piece, and that piece made us less profitable. So it was a short-term win and a long-term seeds of problems.
And so you guys were now going through their affiliated label. So did that actually have any additional savings on your were you able to get rid of distribution infrastructure inside the company, or
Not
did
not
you still
really,
have that?
because like I said, we had like at that point we had a VP of marketing and sales, and we had a one salesperson, and then and maybe one assistant or something, and we didn't get rid of them. They basically continued to do stuff, and they were basically supporting EA Salesforce because you wanted to. The EA Salesforce, they had a big sales force, and regional managers and all regional salespeople, whatever, and so our people would come in and make their presentation on a quarterly basis, and then they would go out with them on to CES and all the trade shows, and basically help them sell our products. So we sort of doubled up. So we really didn't save much, but we did become a big part of their business. I mean, when we became an affiliate label of them, and there was a time when I don't remember. I think I figured out we were 10% of their business.
Wow.
Their business. We were like $10 million and they were 110 million or something. And when you upsort, if we were, and maybe we were getting 8 million from them and they were taking, some percentage of that. So when you valued it up, it was basically almost 10% of their revenue was coming from SSI games.
Yeah,
so
that's crazy.
And that was before they went public. And so actually they went public after that. And so they got value from having SSI as part of them because they're just getting a multiple of their sales when they go public.
Yeah, of course.
So so they made on us, they did very well. And it was a good relationship all in all. And we had just sued them about Questron 2 the year before and had to go through that and came up with a deal that worked for both sides, but it was sort of a little bit of ill will there. And then we made this deal and we're back in the fold working closely with Trip and EA. And that worked out well for years until things got tough in '92. And
before we get to that, I'm guessing that the EA deal is also the reason why Buck Rogers' Countdown to Doomsday gets ported to the Genesis.
To the probably, yeah, because we had the deal with EA. There was a lot of back and forth. We also did Tony La Russa Baseball, which when that came out, we actually sold better than Earl Weaver Baseball, which had been their franchise seller, and our game was better. And so it did better than that. And so they went out and licensed Tony La Russa for the Genesis from us as well. So there were several deals going on there. I didn't even remember Buck Rogers for the Genesis.
Yeah, it was an oddball just because it was a Western RPG on a console at the time, which didn't happen all that often. And I did know that EA was one of the few major U.S. publishers releasing games for the Genesis in that early phase. So that kind of clicked in my head that, okay, that's probably how that came about. And one more issue before we get to 92 was Neverwinter Nights. How did that project come about, and was it supposed to be the beginning of some more online product, or was it a one-off?
No, there was. I'm trying to remember if that was is that the one that was the CompuServe deal?
Yeah, CompuServe or AOL. I can't remember one of the two.
Yeah, I think it was CompuServe. Yeah, that deal came in. I don't know how Chuck ended up putting it together, but and I'm trying to remember, but it didn't Don Daglow and work on that? Yeah, okay. Well, they had done Tony La Russa Baseball for us. So Don Daglow's Stormfront Studios or whatever they were. And basically, I'm sure Don at some point, and maybe Don had done some port work I know what he did. I think he did some Gold Box work. I think we gave him one of the Gold Box games to do.
I think he did one of the Dragonlance games.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So he basically had done that. And it must have come out of that he realized, hey, I can do this as an online game. You'd have to go talk to Don about, how which is interesting because I live about 60 miles from him, and we're supposed to get together someday for coffee here.
Well,
So, and and basically, he probably, had this idea and put it together. All I remember is I think Chuck came to me and said, "Hey, we've got this potential deal where, these guys want to do this, and they'll pay you royalty. Well, they'll pay us royalties for it." And we thought, yeah, what the heck? It's totally non-competing with what we're doing. So uh,
cool.
we did, and yeah, it was just found money as we call it for this. So
Okay.
yeah.
Okay, let's get back then to the overarching story. 1992 rolls around.
Hmm.
And you've got a lot of gold box and gold box style product. The Spelljammer is coming out, and the more book Rogers. Uh, where are the problems?
The problems come in that the gold box was getting old. And so sales were going down. They were easy for us to produce once we had it was like a factory production line of the art department and the scripting department, and then we had the technology, so it wasn't hard to put them out. So those became very easy to figure out how to put out. We knew we needed to go to a new engine. We had Eye of the Beholder, I think, came out in '91, and
Yeah.
basically it was good, but that was an external game, and so we paid royalties on that, and then we paid royalties to TSR. So, and then EA was taking their share. So a lot of people were getting their cut, and we were having a harder time making profit. Being profitable. And we had always been profitable the whole time. After the first 6 months, by September of '80, turned profitable. We were always profitable after that. Well, and by in '91, we started a project in summer of '91. It must have been. We started a project that was to make a second generation gold box game, and at that point, TSR was coming out with their Dark Sun world, and they wanted us to do Dark Sun. And
Mm.
Forgotten Realms had always been the better seller. That was the most natural, fantasy D&D stuff, Lord of the Rings kind of D&D, and basically, so we're going to go to Dark Sun. So we need new technology, and then we wanted to do a Nintendo game because the Pony Canyon in Japan had done a horrible job. Took 5 years, and by the time they put out their game, it didn't do well, and so we never got to take advantage of the council money other than the upfront money they paid us early on, which was important, but it never went beyond that. So we wanted to do a console game, and we also so we wanted to do a Nintendo game for this second generation. We wanted to let's do it ourselves. We'll do this, and we'll do the second generation. And we also wanted to do. There's a lot of appetite for doing a non D&D game for a couple of reasons. One, we only had the license for 5 years plus 2 1-year extensions, so 7 years. So it was
Oh,
going to be
really? Okay.
yeah, so it was going to be up by '94, and who knows what was going to happen at that point. So we wanted to do something else, and we also wanted to do something else where we didn't have to pay 10% royalty to TSR. So we came up with some of the guys in the office played a game based on Renegade Legion, I think was the board game stuff. There was a board game of sort of spaceship combat, and the idea was to do a role-playing game in a science fiction role-playing game using the same engine that we would create for Dark Sun. So if you want to talk about, setting yourself up for failure, here it is, because we suddenly went from a company that was used to doing, small projects that didn't put in more than, the Pool of Radiance was the biggest effort we ever did, and the whole thing only took a year and a few programmers and scripters and some artists, and which was a lot, but it was not that much compared to what we were signing up to now, because the art requirements were getting bigger. So you had it was much nicer stuff you had to do. We had to create a new engine to do the technology, and that was going to be a lot of work. And now instead of just doing it once, we were going to do it in two different game areas, And then not only that, but we were going to do a Nintendo version where we'd never done any cartridge stuff before. So, and
Wow.
Paul, for some reason, we assigned Paul Murray, who is our, great game designer programmer on PCs, and now he's going to do this, Nintendo version, which he had not done before either. And basically, we went a year into the project, and we thought going in it would take a year, and we were a year into the project, and we still couldn't see the end of that, when they were going to happen. It was now, by the time we got to the end of '92, we were a year and a quarter in to a project that was supposed to take a year. And so basically at that point, also Spelljammer, you mentioned Spelljammer, that was another one of those products that's, didn't the product was really buggy, and I don't know if it was the technology issue or what, but it did not work, and it was not a good game. It didn't do well. So that shipped out in the Christmas of '92, and then the tsunami hit, which was the returns. Every year in January and February, you would get your returns based on what didn't sell at Christmas. And that in '93, January and February of '93, it was a tsunami of returns. Basically, the market was going down, everything we were selling was coming back, and now what are we going to do? And by the way, these projects are still going to take seemingly going on forever. So
Mm.
we took drastic action within a couple of weeks. We basically laid off. We had been up to in the summer, the previous year, I think we peaked at 120 employees. And at that point, we started letting people go. We let attrition take its toll because we couldn't afford to keep it going when the games hadn't come out, when Dark Sun hadn't come out. And so we were down to about 100 people, I think, at that point. And we laid off 20 people, I think it was. And it took a hit in the R&D department too, definitely. And basically had to, focus on, okay, what can we do? And the focus was, okay, we're going to do Dark Sun. That's what we're going to do. The Renegade Legion, that's mothballed, and the Nintendo project, that's mothballed because that's going to take a lot of money to get the cartridge. We never figured out how we were going to actually get in the cartridge business, but we figured if we build it, they will come. We'll figure out how to sell it eventually, and that wasn't. That just didn't seem like that was going to work. So the good news was, with the refocused team, Keith and Russ were able to put out Dark Sun by the following September. So it took 2 years to do a game that was, supposed to take one. But at that point, when we did that, we were still like, we could have easily been another year or two away if we kept flailing along trying to do everything. So the action made us profitable immediately in March after we took all the returns, and after we put out Tony La Russa 2 and a few other products that did well, and after we, with the layoffs. So starting in March, we started making money again, but we had lost like $1 million in probably a 6-month period, and
Wow.
that was a lot of money for us, and so we that just drained the coffers basically of SSI. And at that point, we knew that, okay, this was unsustainable for a number of reasons. One, the development cost of products was getting so large. The cartridge business was becoming more of a factor, and that was going to take a lot of money and to be in that market if you wanted to be in that market. So we knew that things couldn't go on this way. It was too risky as a family business with only limited money invested. The only money ever that had come in was all the profits we had earned over the years. So we said, okay, we have to change. We either have to put ourselves, go get venture money and put ourselves on a path to become an independent company and a outside of EA, or we have to sell the company. And at that point, I decided it would be better to sell the company. So we started looking to sell the company. And basically, right at that point, we started seriously looking to sell. And there's a whole series of odd events that took us to where we ended up and the ultimate sale. But the EA situation was interesting because they blocked us. In order to sell, we had to get rid. We had to sell their stock that they, the stock they owned in us would have to be sold too. So, you know, and the problem was through all this time, even though our profitability went down, our number of sales went up. So our stock was now worth twice as much as what EA had paid for it. So
Wow.
basically, for us to buy it back, we would have to pay twice as much as what they had paid, and that had to be factored into any deal that was made. We had literally started buying stock back from them right after the deal started. We were profitable. We started buying it back. We probably bought back, maybe 5 to 10% of everything they owned in us. So maybe 1 or 2% of SSI's stock was bought back from EA using this formula that kept ratcheting up as our sales went up. But our profitability didn't go up because they were taking a big percentage of our profits in the distribution contract.
Yeah.
So, yeah, you look at the
That's a
business side
tough
of it,
one.
you go, yeah, what'd you do there? So, yeah, only have myself to blame. So basically, that was our situation, and like I say, it was crushing for us to have a layoff. We had laid off one person, a part-time high school kid, once in 1982, in the first crash, and that was
Yeah.
due to an odd thing, it went on. So, we never really laid anybody off, and to lay off 20 people out of 100 was, crushing. And as soon as we did that, our VP of sales and marketing, as soon as we said that we were going to do that, like within a week, internally, said we were going to have to work up a management plan on what we were going to do. Our VP of sales and marketing quit and left, and so you have people bailing out basically
Yeah.
when they go, oh, this isn't going to be good. So luckily, we turned it around. I mean. Chuck and I took pay cuts, and we did all kinds of stuff to try to get the cash flow down, and it worked. But we knew long term we had to do something. So and then you're in the mode where everybody knows, well, you're looking to sell the company. So what does that mean for me? What for each person? Like, well, we had a sales and marketing team. We had a production staff. We probably had half, maybe a third of the company, doing production and marketing and personnel and all the stuff that's not R&D. And
Yeah.
and so it was hard for a lot of people knowing that you're going to probably sell, and these things aren't probably going to survive.
Yeah. And so how long does that sales process take
It
ultimately?
took from spring of '93. We ended up releasing Dark Sun in September of '93, and EA was going to buy us, and then it fell through weeks before. We actually held Dark Sun up after being late by a year. It actually shipped like a week or two late because of the EA deal. They had us hold it up, and then the EA deal fell through, and so we
Oh.
basically ended up holding it for nothing. And then the deal finally with so we had a deal that failed with that didn't happen with Spectrum Holobyte, and then the deal with Mindscape was in October of '94. So it's at a year and a half.
So a year and a half. And uh, once that sale happens, did you stay on at the
I did.
company?
Yeah, everything stayed the same pretty much initially, and we stayed in our offices in Sunnyvale. And I basically the only thing that the production team went away, the sales team went away, the marketing team stayed. We convinced them that marketing was something that should stay with the brand, with the the people down in Sunnyvale. And so we kept the marketing and the personnel. We had a big R&D staff. So I think at that point, see, we had already grown back up again some. So I think we fell back down to maybe 70 or 75 people. We maybe we're up to 100. We fell back again. And basically, I stayed with the company. We had an earnout for 1 year, basically. So until the end of what would that be, 95, basically, we were getting the stockholders, which were all the employees were stockholders pretty much. So everybody was getting some extra money based on how well we did in that first year. So we were all very focused on let's do really well this first year, so we could get the earn out. And I was, yeah, I was happy to stay. And so now I was reporting into somebody. And basically that the only thing that changed was I was reporting into somebody at Mindscape in Novato, which was about 50 miles away, and from SSI, and the marketing people were now working with the salespeople at Mindscape instead of at EA, and there was no production internally. Eventually, I'm not sure how quickly that happened, but eventually the production got taken over by Mindscape. Okay. So everything, development wise was good, and we rocketed. I mean, we rocked the first year, and partially because of Panzer General, and because again, the seeds of the Nintendo cancellation of the Dark Sun game was that Paul Murray got put on a project called Panzer General, and Panzer General became a huge, huge hit, best-selling computer war game, I think, of all time, and basically that game came out 1 month after we got bought by Mindscape. So Mindscape loved us because they were selling us like crazy, and we went from something like, I don't know, 10, 12 million in sales, and suddenly at Mindscape's revenue value now, which was the full revenue value, not the affiliated label, what we were getting from EA, but now what we were getting as part of Mindscape when they would sell, we were like $20 million in sales.
Wow.
So they were looking at us going, wow, we just bought a great deal, because we just took off. And but then there were problems with Mindscape, and that's a whole other layer. Issues going on at Mindscape, not at SSI per se.
And so, and I know it's getting a little late. It's going a little long.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'll try to wrap it up. So you guys are now at Mindscape. The D&D license is gone. Was there any attempt to try to negotiate a new deal for that license?
Oh yeah, we wanted to do something. We had Dark Sun, and we extended for the years, and then I think we ended up getting a deal where they let us sell out what we had of Dark Sun and of all the products, basically. So we continued selling what we had. But as far as any new stuff, and the thing about Dark Sun was it was never the big hit that the other games were. Even Eye of the Beholder had done better. Let me see. I think Dark Sun, when it went out, it sold 65,000 copies, and that was basically it. I don't have the sales here. So it went out, sold 65,000 copies, and then didn't sell any more, basically.
Wow. Yeah.
And it just was not. We had technical issues. We had the fact that it was just not a friendly world. It was not a fantasy world. I think that didn't help any. And it's just for a lot of reasons, it just wasn't a big deal. And at that point, we wanted to do more with them, but it was very hard to deal with TSR. Not on the design side, it was very easy to deal with TSR. The business into TSR was horrible, unfortunately. And the owner of TSR, Lorraine Williams, was difficult to work with at the time. And she, in fact, at one point when we were in our darkest despair in '92, and things were looking tough, and we thought, oh, we really should sell the company. She said, well, why don't you fly out to Wisconsin and, I want to talk to you. It's like, okay. Well, and it was important enough that, relationships. So I went to Wisconsin not really knowing what the deal was. And she basically made an offer for the company that was pathetic. And, which we turned down immediately. And she was like, oh, this was her opportunity to get a good deal. And it's like, no, we're not going to do that. So at that point, we turned around and did very well. I don't know if in her mind she thought we were going down and it was just not going to happen, or she was just, now it's time to go on and find somebody else. Her technical people, were basically, I think they kept telling her, keep working with SSI. They know
Yeah.
they're doing good stuff. You're not going to do better. Oh, no, they can get a better deal elsewhere. So she went and made other deals, and as far as I understand, she never made much, after that.
Mhm. Yeah,
So
well, TSR didn't last much longer after that. I mean, well, they lasted for a little while, but another 3, 4 years before they got bought up by WWII. So,
yeah, exactly. So
yeah,
basically, the same thing happened to her that in a way that happened to us, but and Lorraine, I mean Lorraine, her connection, is through Buck Rogers, and that's why we did Buck Rogers, was because of her. We wouldn't have done Buck Rogers if it wasn't for Lorraine Williams and the fact that her grandfather or something somehow got involved in the early licensing. He wasn't the guy who invented Buck Rogers, but he somehow ended up owning or getting it and making money off of Buck Rogers. So
ah,
her family background somehow came through Buck Rogers, and her family wealth came through Buck Rogers. And basically, when they did the role playing at TSR, it was because she wanted to, have their family business, make some extra money, right?
yeah,
And by Buck Rogers, and of course, she wanted the computer game as well, and to make money on that. So, but she wasn't I don't think she was ever a gamer or anything like that. I don't know if she was just business. She got into it I'm not sure how she got into it exactly, but somehow she got in with Gary Gygax at a time when Gary Gygax was early enough, and then things weren't going well, and she ended up getting the company out from under him in a
yeah.
very
Yeah,
yeah.
he used to tell the story that she literally booted him out of his office, and all of his stuff was left behind, and he was escorted out, and she just moved right into his
Yeah,
office.
yeah. The story I heard
Yeah,
was that basically one of the guys who worked there, their you know head of one of the VPs or accounting or something, had heard that Gygax
yeah.
was ready to fire her, and she went to the owners, the brothers who owned the money, who owned a big part of the company, and basically bought that. And so when he said, "You're fired," to Lorraine, Lorraine said, "No, you're fired." So yeah, so she
So,
was a tough
but
one to
there
deal with.
was life after the TSR license for
Absolutely.
SSI. You guys rediscovered your roots, and then there was also some Warhammer product that came in.
Yeah, I think that was the Warhammer license was something. Once we were under Mindscape, there was money available to get licenses. So I think the Warhammer license came in under that. And Panzer General was obviously, yeah, that was just huge, and that was our roots. And we rediscovered that. And so for a while there, we did all right. And but it's the business got tougher and tougher. And actually, what
Yeah.
ended up happening was Mindscape had a games business, and basically inside them they had several different parts of their business, but one part was a games business, and we our games business, their games business was kind of mostly licensed. It started off licensing low end stuff, and they tried to build an internal design team to do a bunch of stuff, and it was shooting high and never really making it very well. They had Chessmaster, which was a big product, but that was like a
Yeah.
line that just cranked along like the Gold Box line, and so the other stuff never really developed. And when SSI came in, we were suddenly the doing great, and we ended up taking over their whole games business. And by that point, I came in to do that, and I did not like it. I didn't like that job, and I didn't last long at all. I lasted 3 months, and I basically resigned from being a corporate executive, and went back to making games at SSI. And then Chuck got to be the head of at that point Chuck was the head of SSI, and ultimately I think Chuck became the head of all the whatever games part was left. So, and it
Gotcha.
was it It probably would have been better if SSI had just been left to its own devices for a while, but we kind of ended
Mm,
up having to absorb in the other stuff, and it was and the business got tough.
yeah. Now, when you say the business got tough, was it just too many other companies fighting for very limited shelf space? Was it a transition away from classic war game tropes, higher production costs? What
Yeah.
was driving that
All
toughness?
all those things. I mean, the the short shelf life and shelves and less shelf space because there's so many products out there, and when you're in a young market, if you're this niche, well, and there's not that much out there for the mass market, your niche can look pretty good because those guys are steady customers. Well, as the mass market gets huge and bigger and bigger, your little niche doesn't look so good anymore because you're just taking up space and they'd rather go for other
Yeah,
stuff. So there's that. There's the development. In order to compete then with the mass market product, the products are now getting much more expensive. As I told you, $1 million development projects. Basically, we're like, okay, we'll blow $1 million on Dark Sun, $1 million on the Dark Sun, on the Renegade Legion, $1 million on the Nintendo. Those are a lot of $1 million you're throwing out there, and it just kept going up and up. And the art, as the technology got better, more was expected of you. So more artwork, more costs in the game, and it's so just to meet the the bare minimum of what you have to do to make a decent game, the costs are just way up there. So yeah, you're getting shoved aside by the cartridge and the console game business, which is becoming a bigger part of the business. So PC is now smaller, and production costs are now larger. It went to a total hit driven business. I mean, there was a time when the business wasn't completely hit driven. Hits were good, but you didn't have to have hits
yeah,
to survive. And then it became a hit driven business. And if you didn't have the hit, you were dead. It's like movies, or something.
yeah.
You could be like a little independent guy, get by, and maybe find a way to survive, or you could be the big producer trying to hit that one big hit for $1 billion movie. Otherwise, you're screwed. You get caught in between, and you're not doing well.
Hmm.
So
And
that
yes, so I like I said, it's getting late, but that leads us to where you are today. So what are you doing today?
well, for the last 20 years, we've been Gary Grigsby and I have been making war games. So I basically went back to making war games at SSI, and then in 2000 left and started 2x3 games with Gary and Keith. And Keith was basically providing the technology tools, and Gary's the war game design, and I'm the development side. And we produce our games through Matrix Games, which is now owned by Slytherin and Slytherin Games. And basically, it's all uh, through digital distribution, online distribution, which is great. Now we do have some distribution that's not direct from the publisher, like Steam as an example. So we have a few games on Steam, and so there's a distribution cut that Steam takes, but and there is some limited amount of returns, and that people can buy it on Steam and then return it if they do it quickly. But it's nothing like what you have with the old world. So in some ways, today's world is so much nicer. Uh, and actually, today with COVID-19, it's obviously much nicer in that we don't have retail, and it does. Distribution on the internet is, it's not even impacted at all. So but so much is different about the way we make games. I mean, we have tester forums, and we have testers all around the world, and we have contributors all around the world, and we have virtual office, and it used to be in the 80s Gary would mail us a disc every week or a couple times a week, and he FedEx a disc to us with the latest version. And now we get everything's done downloaded, so we can all work easily in different locations, and we can get feedback from testers immediately online, and it's, in those ways it's fantastic. So I mean, I'm making war games because that's what I love to do, and that's what I want to keep doing. And luckily Gary is a great game designer and war game designer, and he wants to keep making war games, so that's what we're doing. So right now we're working on War in the East 2, which is our latest in the war in the series. War in the East, War in the West. We hope someday to finish the job we started a year and a half ago, which 2 years ago was the Steel Tigers project, which was the Steel Panthers was the Panzer General was, I think, the biggest war game, certainly the biggest war game SSI ever sold. Steel Panthers was the next biggest and came out a year after Panzer General, and that was a big success in the 90s. Well, it's time to do Steel Panthers. So we're basically, Steel Tigers is us redoing Steel Panthers to the modern day. It's a tactical, tank game, individual tanks and squads of men. So we hope to do that. And those two projects, just Steel Tigers and War in these two, will probably keep us busy for several years.
Awesome. And no worries about shelf space anymore.
No worries about shelf space. So when it's ready, when it's ready, and when it's ready, it's immediately available.
Excellent. Well, Joel, I cannot thank you enough for giving me time for this. Any last words you'd like to say to our listeners?
No, not really. It's interesting to find so many people still finding ways to find the old games. So I keep finding, every so often I see something online or a site or something about with people, revisiting the old games. So they are really great games. I mean, if you can overlook the graphics and some of the interface, it's amazing what was done in terms of the small size of the code and so on. How much gameplay was packed into those early games and all. In some ways, the games have become so much more complex, and in some ways they're great, and in other ways it's like you long for those easy, simpler games.
This is true. This is true.
So,
Okay. But
all right.
hey, thank you very much. And yeah, keep on making the games.
All right. Thanks.
Okay. I hope you've enjoyed another Video Game Newsroom Time Machine interview. You can leave us comments on Twitter, Instagram, and if you like what we're doing here, drop us a couple of bucks on Patreon. All the links are in the description below.